For the first time since last week's election, it was only a week ago, parties are coming together for some postmortems, caucus meetings, asking what went wrong, what worked, and strategizing, of course, for the weeks ahead. So how are they handling the criticism? Who are they turning to for advice? It's Thursday. It's at issue. Chantal Hébert is in Montreal. Andrew Coyne is in Toronto. And Althea Raj also here in Ottawa tonight. Okay, I want to start with the Conservative Party because it seems sort of the hottest at the moment, if I can use that turn of phrase. There have been some anonymous calls for Andrew Scheer to leave, a couple of public ones. And then this comment yesterday by former cabinet minister, former leadership contender, although not in the last race, Peter MacKay. And he said this, take a listen.
Yeah, to use a good Canadian analogy, it was like having a breakaway on an open net and missing the net. People did not want to talk about women's reproductive rights. They didn't want to talk about revisiting the issue of same-sex marriage. And yet that was thrust onto the agenda and hung around Andrew Scheer's neck like a stinking albatross.
So at around midnight last night, MacKay then went on to tweet this. He said that he's repeatedly said he supports Andrew Scheer. He worked hard to help him campaign. Reports of me organizing are false. So that was the way he tried to put the toothpaste back in the tube there. Andrew Coyne, I'll start with you. I mean, you should never actually wield the knife if you are trying to get the job, I guess. But should Andrew Scheer be worried about this buzz that we are hearing, and in the case of Peter MacKay, a very public one?
Yeah, I mean, it's not yet reached the stage where somebody says that he's entitled to make his own decision. But we were also hearing, I think we're getting past the stage of he needs better advisors. It's that kind of low rumbling. You start seeing riding executives, and you start seeing the odd MP or former MP starting to do the running on it. Having Peter MacKay out there, I mean, I suppose he wasn't aware that this would be reported back in Canada, but he had to have been. So this is actually pretty high-level rumbling when you got Peter MacKay out there. I agree with you. There's risks for him in being seen to do this. On the other hand, Mulroney used to regularly put the knife into Joe Clark, and he wound up taking the crown. With much the same song and dance about, oh, I have nothing but support for Mr. Clark, and then you know he'd be briefing reporters to the contrary.
Yeah. So what should Andrew Scheer be doing right now, Chantal?
Reflecting upon his future and whether he can keep that caucus, but also that party in line with a reasonable chance of doing better in the next election. There are those voices, some of them public, but there are not very many voices standing up for Andrew Scheer, frankly, beyond the obligatory, I stand by him. And I think it has become abundantly clear over the past week and a half that if Mr. Scheer were to say that he has decided to resign, a lot of people would say he worked very hard, but those tears that they would have would be crocodile tears.
Althea, what are you hearing from crocodile tears or otherwise?
Yeah, I think what's really interesting is that MPs who have been reelected are themselves saying behind the scenes that they think that Mr. Scheer should go, and even musing aloud about who could possibly replace him and who would be interesting and who are like almost like fantasy football team potential leader would be. And so that, I think if Mr. Scheer really aggressively wants to hang on to his job, then he needs to reach beyond the sort of core inner circle and some of the more veteran voices that he assembled in Ottawa this week and really try to get that caucus under control.
Yeah, I mean, I should point out that no one is brave enough to say these things with their name attached, or very few people. Very few people
but
are brave
it's
enough
early.
For now, it's
a
week and a half, and we're hearing it. If you look at the body language of that Quebec caucus, I didn't get a sense that there was anyone in there that was kind of willing to go public saying we need Andrew Scheer to stay.
One of the
And he
decisions.
he hasn't publicly said, I think, what a lot of people would have liked him to say, especially Quebec candidates and other candidates in Ontario, for example, like a mea culpa, like I'm really sorry, I should have handled the same-sex marriage issue differently, I should have handled the abortion issue differently. We didn't hear that from him in his exit interviews coming out of the election campaign last week.
One of the decisions for that caucus to make at its first meeting is whether it wants to have the provisions of the Reform Act apply to it. Last time around, they had
Michael Chong's bill.
That's right. Last time around, they voted to accept, I think, all but one, the one being the leadership review. But if a majority of the caucus were to vote to adopt the leadership review, then they themselves could exercise it themselves, and all the party would have left to do would be to choose a new leader. I think that's relevant because I think the party has a real choice to make about whether they want to stumble through the next 6 months with this kind of sustained bloodletting where they can't focus their energies on the government, they're just focusing on inward fighting, or whether they want to get this over with quickly.
And remember John Turner, who faced the caucus rebellion, people signed a letter, caucus members, to ask him to quit, and then none of them would own up, or almost none of them would own up to their signature. So
let's turn to the NDP. That caucus met in Ottawa this week as well. There were defeated MPs who were also there. There seemed to be more of a recognition that perhaps they had not won the election, as opposed to what we've been hearing for the past week. Here's what some of them had to say about Jagmeet Singh.
I think the caucus is solid behind him. He was exemplary as a campaigner.
He was not present enough before the campaign. He was not seen in Quebec except for, say, by-elections or one appearance at Tout le monde en parle.
I want him to come in Quebec as soon as possible because I don't want to be alone there.
I think that maybe we caught fire a little too late for people to know and to see what we were representing.
So, I mean, there's some support, certainly. No one's calling for him to leave, Althea, but there is some recognition now.
Some people are.
Okay, all right, you go ahead then.
Well, Carl Bélanger, for example, who was Layton's press secretary and then principal secretary and then national director of the party, penned a column earlier last week, I guess it would be, saying that Jagmeet Singh should resign. And in fact, that if the bar that was set for Thomas Mulcair to step down is being applied to Mr. Singh, then he should step down. And especially when you look at what happened in Quebec, where the party lost all of his seats but one, that Mr. Singh should be shown the door. I don't get that's a general sense held at all in the party. But the question about Quebec remains a very important one. And today we saw Melissa Bruno, who was Mr. Singh's assistant at Queen's Park, who was the national director, announce that she is leaving.
It was in a way the worst possible result for the NDP in that it wasn't such a disaster that they could then sweep out the leader and start afresh. And yet they didn't do very well at all compared to certainly where they were last time. You know, Mr. Singh, for months prior to the election, was stumbling around from one mistake and one accident to the next, and was a deeply unimpressive leader. He had a few good days in the campaign, basically, in which people took a look at him and decided they liked the cut of his jib. But the question is going to be, looking forward, is which is going to be the Jagmeet Singh that people are going to see? Are they going to see the guy that they liked during the campaign, or are they going to see the guy they thought didn't really know his briefs very well prior to the election? And if it's the latter, then they're stuck with a leader that can't really light a fire under voters and can't really advance yards with them.
Chantal.
And he doesn't have a lot of room for more accidents, not in a minority government, where if you overplay your hand, you can either embarrass yourself or end up in a very bad place. And in the case of the NDP, it's going to be a balancing act to look like it's having influence in the House of Commons while avoiding being pushed against the wall by the Liberals saying, you really want an election, guys? Which they can't have, for the record. And I do think Mr. Singh is going to have to think about a leadership review vote because he may lose support from Quebec, support from Saskatchewan. Not sure that Toronto New Democrats are excited over not being on the map. So lots to think about, and that shake-up possibly to bring some experienced hands with the minority rule.
Okay, I got like 2 minutes, and I want to do a quick round on the Liberals, just on the fact that we now know two people that are helping them, Anne McClellan and the ambassador to France, Isabelle Hudon. And we also know that they're taking their time, which is something that they didn't do the last time. They're giving themselves a lot of time to form a cabinet and figure out what's next. What should we take from that, Althea?
I think it's good that they're taking their time. They obviously have new problems to deal with. Alberta and Saskatchewan, you know, how to respond to what voters have told them in those provinces, prime among them. I am perplexed at the choice of Anne McClellan and Isabelle Hudon, to be completely frank. I mean, I understand Ambassador Hudon has some business ties, and Anne McClellan seems like she's the only Liberal that people know in Alberta. And it would have been, I think, interesting to see other people around that group. year, Tony Dean, Senator Dean, has been also serving as an advisor, but he doesn't seem to want to say that publicly. Oops. So I don't know. I mean, the team that is left is a pretty risk-adverse team, and these choices of advisors are kind of a risk-adverse choice. So what does that tell us about where the government is thinking? I think that's interesting.
Chantal.
For all of the qualities of Ambassador Hudon, I think if you asked around in the Quebec political networks, not Quebec Inc., people would be puzzled as to what that she brings to the table that is so needed in these circumstances. So where this goes from there, I thought they were taking their time, frankly, and that goes to what Althea was saying, so that they spend as little time and possibly no time at all sitting in the House of Commons before Christmas.
Andrew, last one for you.
I think precisely that's the reason why they should be calling back the House. I understand why they wouldn't want to, but this is a government with a very weakened mandate. I think it is an obligation to test the confidence of the House, to show that it, in fact, it has the support of the House. I think it has an obligation to deal with some of the divisions and resentments that have been exposed by this election and not just let them simmer for months and weeks on end. That being said, I mean, I hope they've also learned some of the lessons of their first term, which was, when they put together their cabinet, they put a lot of very inexperienced people, politically inexperienced people in the cabinet. Possibly as a result of that, or possibly just because of the way government runs in Canada nowadays, everything was run through the Prime Minister's office. It was notoriously centralized, possibly even more than Stephen Harper's. That is not going to work as well in this kind of atmosphere. They need experienced hands around them, need to be able to trust people like their House leader, whoever they appoint as that, and they need to recognize that they're not in a situation now where they can just ram things through. They're going to have to negotiate on everything they put through, and that's not in this group's DNA. They're going to need to really change the way that they've approached governing.
Okay, guys, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. Appreciate it. There's lots going on, but it's all sort of behind the scenes. So it's good to have everybody there weighing in. Before we go, be sure to subscribe to At Issue, the podcast, for extra content. This week, we're going to talk a little bit about Quebec's values test. Look for it on iTunes and a major podcast app, our website, cbcnews.ca/thenational.